So good evening, and thanks for being with us this evening. We're going to wait a couple of minutes before we have David Carroll up here on the screen with us. As you know, he was unable to fly out here because of restrictions on flying out of New York because of the coronavirus. Let me just take maybe 2 minutes to make 2 points about the film while you gather your thoughts. I think one of the really interesting things for me about the film is the two directors of the film, Karima Mehr and Hirschman. They have made a film earlier, if you've seen it before, The Square, and that was on the Tahrir Square, the Egyptian experience, where exactly the same social media plays an extremely positive role. So what you see is sort of in this film, just I think maybe 4 years later, the flip side of the very same technology, which was able to mobilize politically in order to bring about positive social change. So I think that's one of the sort of thoughts which went through my head as I was watching this film. The other thing I think which we are going to talk about is not only just the question of data as a human right, but looking at our personal data and big data as a resource, thinking of it in terms of among the most profitable, valuable resources to be mined at the moment, and that the basic business model of many of the companies which we are all users of, Google, Facebook, etc., lies precisely not only in using the data which we make over to them to predict our behavior, but also to steer it, manipulate it, and change it in very many ways. So what the film does is, in a sense, visibilize this really invisible world which lies behind our everyday use of these technologies and makes us conscious of the kinds of uses to which companies unknown to us, unaware, that we are sort of almost unaware of what they're doing, are doing with what we are providing to them of this data. We still don't have David here. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of the film. The enigmatic figure, I think, here is one of the protagonists, Brittany Kaiser, but we now have David. So, David, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. David Carroll is Associate Professor of Media Design at the Parsons School of Design at the New School in New York. And the film opens with him, if you recall the first scene, but it opens with a conversation between him and Paul-Olivier Dehaye, which, if you like, is sort of one opening into social media, because although I was told today they know each other, having met briefly once, they've actually connected throughout this whole process in which they've been working together, cooperating to push for the investigation into Cambridge Analytica, also for David to claim his own data rights. They have been doing this virtually. So the very same medium has also been the one which has enabled a whole network of activists, academics to work together in order to get us this far. David, you have been you've been spearheading, in a sense, the successful legal challenge against Cambridge Analytica in the UK in connection with the US presidential election of 2016, and it resulted in the only criminal conviction of the company by the Information Commissioner's Office. So in a sense, it has been a victory, and yet I think it's unfinished business. And I think that's where I would like to start my discussion with you. Where are we today? I mean, the last piece of news I read was the Australian authorities charged Facebook and have threatened to slap really among the most extraordinarily heavy fines of something like a few $100 billion onto them. And the question is anything going to come out of that?
Well, thank you so much. So pleased to have a chance to be there. If not remotely, I would be there in person otherwise. But as you mentioned, it's quite fitting for Paul and I to be interacting remotely, as we have been doing that for a few years now. And indeed, the Great Hack concludes with unfinished business, the business of where is our data, what is the outcome of the Information Commissioner's Office investigation. They seized the servers under criminal warrant, and to this day, they have still not published a report accounting for their investigation. They estimated that it might be available in the previous autumn, so now we're going into the spring, and we still don't have that. And the U.S. election is in full gear, and so we don't have an accounting of the UK investigation. So we see an unfortunate delay in getting that truth out. There are many reasons why we could imagine that this is delayed, and we can talk about those, but it is unfortunate that there is a totally neutral, reliable entity that has conducted a forensic investigation on the questions that so many people had coming out of the scandal, and the public still doesn't know. And I'm still having to fight for getting access to my complete data set, and that isn't resolved yet. Although my lawsuit in insolvency court did resolve with the judge ruling against me, which was very costly, but it did provide some positive outcomes, winning some battles along the way. For example, we contributed towards pressuring the administrators to release passwords to the ICO because there were servers they were having trouble getting into. So there was a role in the litigation in assisting the regulator, and that's one of the interesting lessons, that now that it's sort of in its final chapter, is what is the role of private citizens in participating in enforcement of data rights.
So do you think there is any likelihood of the Australian case leading to Facebook not only having to pay huge fines, but as a result changing some of the kinds of business models that they've been using?
It's interesting because the Australian regulator is the most recent, but there are so many active investigations and lawsuits that are in progress, many in the United States, and actions around the world have concluded. Brazil and Colombia recently issuing decisions, and many other countries. So the international footprint of the regulatory action is significant and continues to haunt Facebook, even though Cambridge Analytica is defunct. So when we could imagine the sum total of all these investigations concluding, then there'll be the work of piecing their findings together and also seeing what impact it may have had on the company's conduct. The only thing that we can point to specifically for what's different in the United States and other places in the elections since 2016 is the Facebook ads library, which publishes a campaign's ads for civil society to review. And we have seen a case recently where a journalist has drawn attention to deceptive conduct related to the census, in fact, and that has caused Facebook to take action in which its census disinformation policy trumped its not fact-checking politicians policy. So we are seeing some interesting ways that Facebook has to act as an arbiter, even though it doesn't want to.
One of the things which struck me while watching the film was that Cambridge Analytica obviously has been advertising, making no bones about the fact that they've been influencing elections all over the world. As long as there were elections in Africa and Asia, nobody seemed to care, and they got more and more engagements for their putative or real successes. The minute it was the 2016 election in the US and then the Leave campaign, so UK and US, and then it becomes a real problem. So I think there does seem to be a sort of a north-south divide here, and that's why I was also interested when you said there are repercussions in Brazil and Colombia. Could you say something about that difference?
Sure. It was Christopher Wiley, one of the self-proclaimed whistleblowers, who was, early out labeling and categorizing Cambridge Analytica and SCL as a form of digital colonialism. And so there is an sort of under-discussed dimension of how this is an expression of a new kind of colonialism. And indeed, I felt a kind of strange historical colonialism when I filed my original complaint to the ICO on July 4th, 2017, which is Independence Day in the United States, essentially saying, why is a British company interfering in my American democracy? So it is that sensibility of interference as a business that is sort of the most upsetting part when you discover your election has been managed by this company. With regards to decisions that have been made in South America, particularly Brazil and Colombia and their data protection authorities, we just see examples of these countries applying the laws they have on the books and recognizing the importance of these issues. I had the fortune of traveling to Santiago, Chile, for a major congress there in January. And I was really impressed by, especially in a place that had just emerged out of what they call a political revolution, how this topic was very important and resonated. And indeed, Chile is trying to consider being the first country to pass a neural rights law, which would give people rights to their mental thoughts as we move towards brain-computer interfaces. So the way that the global south, the developing world, is leapfrogging the United States in terms of passing data protection laws and seeing this as a real threat to their national autonomy and the stability of their democracies.
So if we take one step back to the very start of the story, where you began to demand the right to access all your own information, and the process which you used is one of reverse engineering, so to speak, to be able to demand this data. Could you just explain a little bit about how you went about doing it? Because I think if I remember right, a statement of yours which really stuck in my memory was that the right to access is a fundamental right, which all other demands will then be able to build on, so that it does seem to be the crucial element in our ability to protect our own data, the right to access data through reverse engineering.
Yes. One of the ways that the film is called The Great Hack by the directors is in some ways how people were able to hack back against the system. And engaging in transnational data protection arbitrage to seek truth and find answers and seek accountability. And to that I owe it all to Paul, who I feel recruited me and educated me and motivated me to embark on this quest and assisted me through the process and helped me gain an appreciation for why this was necessary to perform, and that it would be easy, and he was right, and that we would be able to prove initial parts of our hypothesis instantaneously, which we did. And the weird irony or bizarre feature of this scandal is that if Cambridge Analytica had been an American company and had kept Americans' data in the United States, rather than exporting it to a data protecting state like the United Kingdom, that then I would have had no recourse. I would have had no rights, no ability to get answers, no transparency requirements, no disclosure, nothing. And so it highlights the problem of the American privacy model, that it has no right of access fundamental to it. And it wasn't until January of this year that California residents became the first in the country here to get a right of access through the California Consumer Privacy Act. So it's slow going here, but there is finally a realization that the first step towards preventing data abuse is the right of access, the right to know, and then fighting the battle over the contours of that knowledge. How much can we know, and how much will be concealed from us?
Maybe one final question, and I turn to both the panel members here, and I think Paul may, however, want to have a direct word with you, of course. But before I do that, because you said some things have changed, my question to you would be, have rules changed enough? Because what we are probably going to see in the 2020 election is the Bloomberg data machine and the data empire as opaque as anything else that we have seen so far. And the question is, are we still going to be seeing ongoing Russian interference? Is it just going to be less detectable? What do you expect of the 2020 elections?
Yes, unfortunately, no new rules were enacted in the wreckage of 2016. Many proposals, many wonderful bills, but nothing saw the light of day. And all the actions have been done voluntarily by companies such as Facebook, either responding to local legislation or just trying to head off regulation more generally. So the Bloomberg campaign has been interesting because it entered into the campaign late in the sort of flow of things, a huge amount of digital spending and voter data analytics by a company called Hawkfish, which is a private company for profit created by Bloomberg and recruited from Silicon Valley and Goldman Sachs, et cetera, to be the Cambridge Analytica of the Democratic Party. So a billionaire-funded, opaque, private data analytics and media shop and political consultancy that, you know, is allegedly sort of working on the side of the Democrats, but is under less regulatory scrutiny than Cambridge Analytica was. Because Hawkfish is what I was describing before, an American company that exists in the United States only and has not put itself under the jurisdiction of a data protecting state. So we have no recourse to know what Hawkfish is doing on behalf of Bloomberg. So it puts us in this awkward position of, well, at least he's on my side, but what is he doing? And we just can't know.
So with this pessimistic note, I'm going to turn to the two panelists here in the room. Feel free to stay on with us, David, but I don't know how good the technology is going to be to be able to connect you into the conversation. I have with me two panelists this evening, Dr. Paul-Olivier Dehaye, whom you saw right at the beginning of the film talking to David in the very first shot, I think, of the film. A mathematician by training. He's the director of Personal Data, I.O., It's a Swiss nonprofit focused on making data protection rights accessible, actionable individually, also collectively useful, and the NGO offers services to protect ourselves against what Susanna Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. It addresses activists, journalists, researchers, and others within civil society. The one quote that I want to come back to you with a question as soon as I've introduced Stéphane in a moment is something which is on your website, which really struck me, where you say data isn't the new oil. It's something which someone says in the film as well. It's as valuable as oil, but you say it's the new CO2. And I think that's something I would like to pursue with you in a moment. The other panelist here this evening is Stéphane Duguin, and he is a former officer who has, sorry, I've got to go back to my notes. He has been working on questions of cybersecurity for the Europol, cybercriminality and cybersecurity as part of the Counterterrorism and Cybercrime Center. He has been looking at the whole question of deep fakes, which I will come to discuss with him in a moment. But one of the things I do want to discuss with both of you as well is we are in Geneva, and what role could Geneva play in a lot of the questions that are under discussion this evening. And here we come to the fact that Stéphane is the newly minted Chief Executive Officer of Geneva CyberPeace Institute. So this is a private company solely funded by the private sector, including funded by Microsoft, MasterCard. Contributors are Facebook, the Hewlett Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. It is a neutral and an independent entity and works on principles of nonprofit. It has a three-pronged function: assistance, accountability, and advancement to assist vulnerable communities, promote transparency, I quote from the website, and advance global discussion on acceptable behavior in cyberspace. And I think accountability is a question which came up very often in the film, which I would like to come back to you with. So it's a question both of stability and security of the global architecture which we have built upon. And one of the questions I want to discuss with you is a quote where you say in an interview, "No state or non-state actor should take actions that impair the stability of cyberspace, but that they too should be guided by principles and bounded by norms." And I would like to discuss with you what the architecture of those norms should be, could be, and what role Geneva plays in them. But let me start to go back to the question I wanted to discuss with you, Paul, on the question of data isn't the new oil, it's the new CO2. Shall we start with a comment from you on what are the poisonous effects of the byproducts of this data in our lives?
So I like that quote because data is the new oil evokes individualistic search for profit, while of course the CO2 metaphor appeals to the collective side effects. One of the obvious side effects from this movie is the whole pollution of this information ecosystem, where it's not just that content is served to us, content that is potentially false, but it goes much deeper, where we don't know how it is served to us. We don't know what kind of factors came into that. And so we don't know what is true, we don't know what is false, we don't know how it's served. It's much deeper. It's a much deeper questioning of our consumption of information. But there are other side effects. Some companies operate through platforms that completely create new side effects that were not anticipated at first. So to take an example, Uber in any city dispatches drivers to potentially work because they're just waiting. Uber tries to oversupply drivers. So they are dispatching drivers all over the city, which leads to pollution that just didn't exist before. There were recent statistics that showed that that a ride taken in an Uber is actually 70% more polluting than a ride taken the regular way, let's say. So this is again an example of a company optimizing for their own profit and creating side effects. In this case, CO2 literally.
The one question I think which maybe the two of you may want to discuss is exactly what you just said. Given the environment of informational insecurity, it's very hard to be able to separate truth from falsehood. And this is, I think, where the film also ends by saying the journalist who's one of the other protagonists in the film, Carroll, who is saying it's impossible to be able to know what exactly we are being served and where we're being manipulated, what is true and what is not. So the question of informational insecurity is something that you point to, but for Stéphane, it's a question of the whole architecture of security. And so I think both of you are dealing with two very different aspects of security and security of data in this digital infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening to everyone. When you speak about architecture, it calls to why we choose to focus on CyberPeace and not cybersecurity, because the architecture is on a different level, in fact. If you look into what the story of Cambridge Analytica unveils is a systemic flow at different layers of the architecture. In order to have a peaceful environment where you and I can exercise our democratic right, exchange, argue, disagree, not being manipulated, not being threatened or subject to violence, you need to have this space, the physical digital space, if I can use that language, meaning the protocol, the pipes, the network, and that space needs to have some features that allows for as much as neutrality as possible. So it can be by design facilitating mass surveillance or disinformation, etc. So that's the first of the architecture. The second is to be sure that this space can be accessed by civilian anywhere in a way that is not going to make them threatened or easy to censor or easy to manipulate. And the third, you're mentioning it before, is the ecosystem of norms that is supposed to happen around this in order to dictate responsible behavior in the cyberspace to be sure that there's not going to be an escalation of violence, etc. What is something that you said about this pollution? These free spaces are polluted by explosion or different protocols and network that doesn't really speak to each other, or at least are not thought of in line with what is happening at normative level. And on the norm side, we have an explosion of norms, a very fragmented ecosystem of norms, where at the end of the day, everyone can do a bit whatever they want, because there's so many norms with so many evaluation of the norm. It's difficult to find, a clear view of what is supposed to be the guideline for responsible behavior. And that links to something you mentioned, accountability. If you have an ecosystem that is not clear in terms of the architecture, and you cannot decipher what is true, what is false, and what you were saying, what are the processes behind me accessing data, accessing a structure, then it's very difficult to have an accountability framework because you cannot demonstrate anything. You cannot even link any action to any actors, and that's an issue today.
So if I understand you correctly, one of the problems of the cybersecurity or insecurity is because of deepfakes, fake identities, being unable to even trace who is putting what information onto the web. But it also then involves states manipulating not only their own electorate, but also interfering in the elections of others. So that what we are thinking now is also in terms of a whole geopolitical consequences of a certain kind of cyber architecture.
Yeah. Today, let's take the example of what happened in Georgia and this sequence of attribution that happened in October last year. So you have a series of states calling off another state, Russia in this case, saying that most probably you, Russia, attacked Georgia in the set of cyber attacks. If you dig into it, you cannot find the evidence, the grounds upon which the statements are made. It's very difficult to find them, and if you find them, you will easily find somewhere else on the internet with source information that are really difficult to double-check, stating it's true or it's false. So it's very difficult to make a decision making. What this shows is that as long as we don't have an accountability framework where fakes can be detected, where proxy attacks are not facilitated because of protocols allowing state A to pretend to be an actor B in order to attack a state C, then it's going to be very difficult to have a responsible behavior on the attack side of the cyberspace when some rare cyber attacks, or on what we saw with this movie in terms of manipulation at scale of content.
Paul.
In your previous answer, you mentioned the word demonstrating, and now you use the word evidence. There is a strong rejoinder there for me with these ideas. I'm very much of the opinion that we should be able to get evidence. The question is, who is we? Who should get that evidence, and who should have this ability to demonstrate things? So I'll just mention one event that happened during the 2016 elections, where Alex Stamos, the chief security officer of Facebook, was trying to figure out who was interfering and how, and was trying to defend internally at Facebook the writing of a report that would name Russian actors as Russian actors, not just some actors from an unnamed country. And he wanted to also out, essentially, the accounts that were doing this. They knew that those were clearly malevolent actors, clearly malevolent accounts, and he wanted to name them so as to enable journalists to get the evidence, maybe even law enforcement or other authorities to get evidence that they needed to start acting on this. And the response he got was that this was impossible because of GDPR. Or because of privacy laws, actually. This is what he says in the interview, because it was in 2016. So that internally, lawyers at Facebook told him that because of privacy laws, we couldn't name those Russian accounts as being behind these attacks. And I think that shows that who has the evidence? Those who have the most evidence are the platforms. And they sometimes leverage security aspects for their own business interests, and sometimes they leverage even privacy interests for their own PR interest in some sense. To me, the way to untangle all of this, from a Geneva perspective especially, is to think about who is the victim. Who is the victim in all of this? And essentially, the victim are the populations. The populations who just don't know who was trying to interfere. I'll pick a different example, the referendum in Catalonia, where there was potential interference from outside on Twitter, fake pictures that were circulated. We don't exactly know where from. Who is there to tell the population that these were circulated by Russian actors or not? Or is this the Madrid government? Is it the Barcelona government? Who has the evidence to show this? I think personally that Twitter should have been much more transparent to individual users, saying the potential, those actors have tried to interfere with your information ecosystem at this moment. And then it would be up to those individuals or their collectives that they might form to try to explain what that meant to them, to those victims. And that's where I think really Geneva comes into play, because we need to think about these victims. We need to think about these victims interacting with a vast array of different actors that have a huge amount of power. And that's the history of Geneva, in part.
So what could, just before I turn to the audience for questions, what concrete suggestions would you have on the one side for collective action? Because on the one hand, we have these as individual rights. We're demanding them as the right to data as our individual rights. On the other hand, you're calling for collective action. So what kinds of institutional forms should this kind of new normative regulatory architecture take, such that the collective action should be demanding a certain kind of resolution to the problem that you've just pointed to? What role could Geneva play?
So I don't think it's necessarily a new institution. We have institutions that can provide knowledge that is trusted. We have universities, for instance, that can do part of that job. But it might be that we need a different understanding of how data rights interact with other fundamental rights. For instance, the right to access information or the right to benefit or participate in science. That last right is often tied to citizen science efforts. The fact that citizens could collect data for themselves to assess, well, let's pick that example again, how the local plant is polluting their atmosphere, right? This is their right to conduct this science, to collect evidence, so they can better advocate for their own interests. And we need to understand that this dynamic is also possible around data, if only these individuals are accompanied by all the legal help they need so that they can exercise their right to their data. David is just one example. It could have been 10 like him, could have been hundreds, it could have been 300 million of Americans that Cambridge Analytica was boasting of profiling with the perspective of the US election. If you think about Uber, it could be 10 drivers in Geneva, 100 drivers in Geneva, 1,000, maybe all over France, maybe all over Europe, trying to reverse engineer how the platform is partially manipulating them for its own profit. So it's just a perception of how these individual rights interact with, individual data rights interact with other fundamental rights.
Just one last point to Stéphane, and then we just open out while you collect questions that you would like to ask. I'll take 3 at a time, maybe for 10 minutes or so. Stéphane, one question on exactly this question of individual usership and individual rights. That we do have the feeling that we have free access to many services, free in the sense that we are not paying for them, but free also in the sense that we have the illusion of being able to choose. And the question is, in a sense, this feels like an exercise of free will, just because I have an exercise, I can exercise a choice. And yet the question is, what we have learned from the film today is the enormous extent of manipulation. And the whole question of cyber attack would basically then be limiting both what I can think and what I can do. So what is it that a company like yours could do to mitigate this entire set of really serious problems which I as an individual user would have?
Yeah, I'll build on this question and replying to what Paul was mentioning before. That is, I think, crucial. That's critical to this conversation. You were hinting that it's very important to have the victim as the center of the whole system, and that's where Geneva can play a good role. And I totally agree with you. What could happen and what we could leverage, and it goes to your question, is that if you focus on the victim and what is their stories when they are becoming victim of large-scale cyber attacks or large-scale manipulation, and if you provide to them a platform where evidence can be gathered and put public in order to serve one action, collective action, at least as a memory of what has been investigated and find out, then you give a building blocks upon which coalition of victims can it can be a place for trust and for neutral conversation in order to advance this conversation. And that ties to your question, because a lot of these victims are willingly providing personal data on a daily basis in a large scale, because we all like the fact that we have very easy, frictionless services that allow us to communicate at scale, etc. So we participate to that. At the same time, there's no counterbalance. There's not also for us an easy and free access to what this means and the evidence of all the manipulation and attacks that we are victim. If we would have this putting back the symmetry and this balance in terms of ease of access, but also ease of information of what this costs, then it could change the whole mechanics.
Yeah, I agree. But again, I think we have a lot of those building blocks already there. To me, it's about changing a culture that is partly preventing us from imagining we could build those alternative systems or those counter systems. It's not going to take one person, it's not going to take 10, it's going to take many of them thinking together, yes, this is possible to do, and this is kind of a citizen effort. So it's more about changing culture than anything.
I'm looking around and haven't seen any hands up yet. Okay, one right at the back.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I have a small question. Given the place that we are in today, I have this feeling that collectively our humanity is totally unable to deal with the problem we're facing today. Being in Geneva, looking at the United Nations as a model, however dysfunctioning it may seem, how come we have not come up looking at data and building a world data organization? With institutions, with mechanisms, and it feels like everything is going towards the industry again. We always find the same actors: Microsoft, HPs, and the usual too fat to change companies. We should do something about this.
I'm looking around to see if I've missed anybody. Yes, one more.
Maybe a related question. Why are these very large players, the platforms, an unregulated profession? I mean, states regulate banks, states regulate pharma industries. Why are they unregulated, and why are they so large and not broken up from an antitrust perspective?
I can take one more question, if someone is quick enough. Okay. So we're going to have both of you answer those two.
So building in between the two questions, and building from mostly the experience that I have as a EU staff in an EU institution, because I could witness in a lot of data-centric or tech-centric fields the very difference in literacy and capacity in between states, so EU states in this context, and large companies. I'll give you the example of a fight of online propaganda by branded terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or Daesh. If you were going into meetings and you were looking into the capacity to respond, to plan, to advocate narratives that are going to be forward-looking in between the states and in between the companies, there was a clear asymmetry. There was a clear disbalance. So part of what you see is just a matter of dynamics in terms of, at some points, the ones that are the fastest to act, the more prompt, with more capacity to act, are the ones that invest the field. Does it give legitimacy? I would say no. But practically speaking, this is exactly what was happening. And in a field where you could imagine in the EU, normally the capacity of the EU states would have been quite high. How come that this did never organized itself into a model like the one that you were mentioning, and why, as you were mentioning before, that didn't trigger some countermeasure against this monolithic blockage of large-scale companies that are investing in the field? I guess that would have to come from civil service, from the states. For what I know from the states and the planning of states and how they think about this nature, there's two issues. States are thinking local and thinking linear. They are still planning because of what they can reach in terms of their local policy. And these issues are totally global, so it's very difficult to think about it. And the second is linear, is that states, when they plan a new agency or a new plan, they think of what happened 2 years before. They have big trouble, for the one that I could see with my career, to think how this convergence of exponential technology are going to disrupt model that would lead to this kind of unforeseen abuse or global misbehavior. That's my 2 cents on this one.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good answer. I would not have been capable of giving that. But to try a different way of saying the same thing, this is an issue about power. This is an issue about states asserting power over very, very, very large industries that are even bigger than them in some cases. Very large companies, I mean. What really strikes me is that instead of building a world data organization, which is going to take a lot of time, a lot of skill, a lot of effort and everything, there might have been some very momentary effort that states could have done that would have had a huge impact in terms of reasserting power back to states. So in the movie, you see Zuckerberg going to the US Congress and testifying. He also went to the European Parliament and testified. He was called into the UK Parliament and that didn't want to go testify. There was what I joke and call an intergalactic parliamentary committee that was assembled with 9 different countries represented to try to call him to testify. He didn't go either. The answer was, well, I can't go to every parliament in the world to go to testify, right? But states could have come together and said, fine, but you should come to Geneva. You should come to New York to testify, to the UN. This is where states get together and start to try to express a common will. So it's not about building an organization, in my view. It's more about asserting power, and there are different ways to do that. And calling Zuckerberg to testify to the UN would have been a very bold move in a sense, but very, let's say, transformative move.
Something else, another thought on specifically your questions, the why these large companies are investing resources and time into this. In the ecosystem of norms today, there's a lot of ambiguity and void. So if you really want to assert a politics in terms of what should happen in cyberspace, both in terms of attacks or content, is very complicated because of ambiguity and void. What I feel with these companies is that they, because I guess of their nature of making business, they invest the space. They say no one is there. We have the capacity, we have the means, we are going to recruit official left and right, etc., and we are going to invade that space. Again, it's a question of dynamics, and I agree with Paul. It will not take so much for states to also invade the space and to say, we are here because this is supposed to be our space, this is supposed to be us driving the conversation. I'm a firm believer it has to be multi-stakeholder, because these companies are, both in terms of responsibility, infrastructure, reach, and clients are key stakeholders to this, but there's a clear role for space that has been just left empty. And what I could witness, again, taking the example of the terrorist propaganda online, you would imagine that state, would be strong. What's the platform today where the content is gathered, analyzed, and where companies are training each other? It's the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, and that's company-led. And not because there was an agreement, something like this, because they started and they did it, and the state looked at it.
Paul, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so another way states could assert power is what the UK started doing, or what this parliamentary committee started doing, and saying, if Zuckerberg comes to the UK, we'll get him arrested. That's very extreme, of course, but it could be the UK, it could be Canada tomorrow also, it could be France also, it could be more and more countries like this, which increase the pressure, cost almost nothing, and is a way to rebalance the conversation, which indeed, after a very short while, should be multi-stakeholder, of course. But this is a way to do something about it. On the antitrust issue, because it wasn't said, there is another element, which is that part of how antitrust works is to assess the benefit to the consumer. And so that requires pricing. The main feature of those business models is that the money that is transiting is completely opaque. You don't know, right? You don't know how much it costs. It's free to the user. So these old theories fall apart, and we don't have the theoretical framework to understand this, and we don't have a deep enough understanding of enforcement to collect the evidence that would help build the theories. So what I refer there is more data protection issues, assessing exactly the data flows so that we can leverage this understanding of data flows to build a theory of antitrust in this context.
I think with that, I'm going to close the discussion here. Thank you very, very much for being with us this evening. And I'm going to close with just giving you a quotation from the director of the film, who I think really sums up the problem in one sentence when he says, we realized while we were making the film, we realized that the real hack that we needed to look at was the hack of the mind. And what is happening inside our news feeds and what happens when people are creating their own truth because they are being micro-targeted. And I think that is sort of the main message which the film wants us to leave with. But I think what the discussion has shown is the possibilities of collective action, both for us as individual users, by states, and also non-state actors and the private sector, in order to be able to change some of the parameters under which this particular abuse of social media and digital technologies is operating at the moment. So I think we can end on an optimistic note with at least some pointers to action that could be taken individually and collectively. So thank you very, very much for this very interesting conversation on a very complex set of issues. And I hope this is not the last occasion that you're here at the Institute. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.